In this video, we're going to be exploring percents in a little bit more depth. In this image, you see what looks like a double number line or a unit bar that's showing a part of the whole and the corresponding percent for each. And then you'll be asked a series of questions about those. For instance, question number 1 says 75% is what fraction of the quantity? So if we find 75%, that corresponds to the number 3, but 3 is a part of the whole. So there are 4 parts in the whole, so 75% corresponds to 3/4 of the whole. So that would be the fraction, because that's 3 out of the 4 total parts in the whole. 1/4 is what percentage of the quantity? So we would find 1, and this represents 1/4 because there's 4 parts in the whole. So 1/4 corresponds to 25%. Question 3 says 37.5 is what fraction of the whole? So if we look at this as a double number line, we don't see 37.5% depicted on here, but 37.5 is 12.5 more than 25 and 12.5 less than 50. So we can assume that it falls right here on our double number line or tape diagram, which means it would correspond halfway between 1 and 2. So you might be tempted to write 1.5 fourths of the whole fourths. But we don't want to use decimals in your fractions, so you're going to have to rename this fraction, and we can do that by multiplying each side by 2 to get it to 3/8, and that would be the proper form to write this fraction. So make sure you're just aware of that as you write fractions down. The next question says 1 is what percent of the whole? Well, you might think we've already been asked that question because if we look, 1's right here. But remember, this isn't really 1, it's 1 of the 4 parts. So this really corresponds to 1/4. So if you see 1, that's referring to 1 whole. 1 whole is the same thing as 4/4 because this is a fraction bar. So 1 whole would also represent 100%. These questions aren't too tricky, but it's something you'll see and probably see again, so you have to know how to read this type of unit bar, double number line, fraction ratio chart. Once again, we're going to be working with these types of questions. I'm going to just use a calculator here to save time, but it's so important that you have this understanding that decimals are a unit rate, meaning we get rid of the denominator or make it 1, so we don't need to say it. And percents are an expression of a fraction with a denominator of 100 per 100. This is an essential concept, so we're going to keep drilling this in. So at the top, if you see the fraction 1/5, to get it into decimal form, we need to get rid of that denominator or make that denominator 1. We can do that, and I'm going to just write it out somewhat sloppy down here at the bottom. We can do that by dividing out the denominator. So in order to get it to a unit rate, because decimals are a unit rate, we need to divide each side by 5. And you probably already know 1 divided by 5, but if not, I'll do it right here. And that is 0.2. So as a decimal, we would call this 0.2. As a percent now, it should be very simple by now to move from decimals to percents because decimals have a denominator of 1. Percents have a denominator of 100. So we're just multiplying by 100. So that would be 20%. Sometimes I've seen people just start referring to this as 1/5 as 20. It's not. It's 20 per 100. In the next problem, just clear my annotations. In the next problem, we're given a percent, which is 78.5, remember what that means. If it's a percent, what we're saying is it's 78.5 per 100. So if we want to get it to a decimal, the decimal has a denominator of 1 because it's a unit rate. So we don't want to express the denominator. We don't want to say it as a fraction form. The only way to do it is to get the denominator to 1. So we divide by 100, and the decimal would be 0.785. How to represent that as a fraction? We could call it, we don't want to have decimals in our fractions, and this is where it gets a little bit confusing, because you might be tempted to say it's 0.785 or 78.5 per 100, but that has a decimal in it. So one simple way to get rid of the decimal is to make each side 10 times bigger. So we make 78.5 10 times bigger. Now it becomes 785 per 1,000. It's not in simplest form. So how do we get 785 per 1,000 in simplest form? Well, we can see what we can divide both sides by. One thing that should be obvious is we could divide both sides by 5. You do want to get these fractions in simplest form. Simplest form is the simplest way to work. So if we divide each side by 5, and I'm going to use a calculator, 785 divided by 5 is 157. 1,000 divided by 5, and you should be able to do this in your head if you know 100 divided by 5. This could be 200. So the proper way to write this fraction, and this is going to be important for full credit on what we call these mastery tests, would be to write 157 per 200. So keep that in mind. Same thing with the decimal. On this next one, when we're moving to a percent, remember this denominator is 1, so we're going to multiply by 100. And so we have 67.5%. Okay, so remember right now we have that's expressed with a denominator of 100, so we're getting close to getting rid of this denominator. But I don't want to write that as fraction form because I don't want to put decimals in there. So let's make it 10 times bigger. So move this decimal over here. So it's 675 per 1,000. Once again, we see we can divide each side by 5. So we know 1,000 divided by 5 is 200. 675 divided by 5 is 135. Now in this case, you'll also notice, wait a minute, we can still divide each side by 5 again. So now we have 27. Let's see, 200 divided by 5. If you know 20 divided by 5, then 200 divided by 5 should also be simple, and that's 40. And we can't reduce that anymore. So we would call this 27/40. What's interesting is you'll see 27/40 no longer looks anything like 0.675 or 67.5%, but it is the same thing. So keep in mind getting those fractions to, we call the simplest unit form. So it's still whole numbers, but it's as low down as we can get them. For this next part, we want to determine the value of percent. So if you want to find 45% of 90, I'm going to work quickly through this. Percent number. So we know 45% of 90, 100% would be 90. So if we want to get to 45%, there's a lot of different routes we can take, and this is what we've been working on before. You can go, some people want to, I'm going to just go to make it simple, I'm going to go to 10%, would be 9, because I'm going to kind of do this in my head. So 40% would be times 4, which would be 36. and now I need to also find 5%. But you can take whatever path you want, so 5% would be half of 10%, so that would be 4.5. And to get to 45%, you would need to add 36 plus 4.5, which is 40.5. 45% of 90 is 40.5. To do 150%, like is in the next problem, I'm not going to go through it, you start with 100%, and then you need to get bigger. So you need to find what 50% is and then add them. You might be able to do this in your head. The answer would be 18. In this type of problem, when you have a percent and a number, 7 is 65% of what number? Now, we're given a part. We don't know what 100% is. The question is asking, 7 is 65% of what number? So we need to find the number, which means we need to find what 100% corresponds to. So like the last problem, where we found 45% is 40.5, it's telling us now, so 40.5 is 45% of 90. For this next problem, it's not telling us the whole, but it's telling us the relationship between the number 7 and the percentage. So we know 7 is 65%. We want to find out what the whole number is, 100%. So there's a lot of different pathways you can get there again. So how do you get to 100%? Well, I mean, I can go down to 5 if I want to. I can take whatever pathway I want. So to go from 65 to 5, I need to divide by 13. So now I need to do the same thing to 7. I'm going to divide both sides by 13. Ooh, and that's 0.538. Now, to get it to 100%, I need to multiply by 20. So I'm going to multiply this side by 20, and that's 10.77. So we just found that 7 is 65% of 10.77. It's working in reverse here. So that's something you're just going to need to watch.